Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a world where dinner wasn't so much a meal as a logistical nightmare. A world of vast steppe horizons, horsehair tents, and one man who expected to be fed in ways that defied the patience of cooks, servants, and probably half the goat population of Central Asia. Yes, we're talking about the Mongol Khans. Specifically, the bizarrely complicated subject of feeding them. Because of course, being the supreme ruler of the largest land empire in history wasn't stressful enough, they had to make eating into its own kind of war campaign. So, if you're tucked in, blanket pulled up, maybe sipping something that doesn't involve fermented mare's milk, let's wander into the yurts of the Mongol elite and see how their appetites shaped history. Feeding the Great Khan wasn't just about food. It was about politics, ritual, and a very careful dance around the fact that this was a man who could have you executed for sneezing near the soup pot. And yet, oddly, for all the terrifying power, meals often ended up being surprisingly rustic. The Mongols, after all, weren't known for elaborate cuisine. Their empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, but when it came to dinner, they remained stubbornly faithful to the basics of the steppe. The centerpiece of it all was meat. Horse meat, sheep, goat, and sometimes the occasional camel if things were dire. There's a recurring image in the sources: great piles of boiled mutton, tossed into bowls with little ceremony. No seasoning, no garnish. Just steaming slabs of animal, straight from the pot. One has to admire the efficiency. The Khan wanted meat. He got meat. And then there was the drink. Fermented mare's milk, arag, was the real national beverage of the Mongols. Imagine a fizzy, sour, low-alcohol yogurt, but served by the bucket. It was considered cleansing, strengthening, and the surest way to prove you belonged among the steppe aristocracy. Guests were expected to drink it. Declining was dangerous. And the Khan himself? He drank it constantly, usually while reminding visiting ambassadors that their empires were about the size of his summer tent. But here's the strange part. For all their blunt, earthy diet, the Mongol Khans became unexpectedly picky once they started ruling cities. Genghis Khan himself wasn't exactly fussy. He ate like a soldier, slept like one, and probably smelled like one. But his descendants, they started developing standards. By the time of Kublai Khan in China, feeding the ruler became a full-scale production. Kublai was still technically a Mongol warlord, but he also styled himself as a Chinese emperor. That meant he had access to cooks who knew about rice, spices, pastries, and the magical thing called vegetables. Naturally, he made it everyone's problem. A Venetian merchant, you may have heard of him, Marco Polo, claimed that Kublai's kitchens prepared more than 1,000 dishes at each meal. And no, that wasn't hyperbole. It took hundreds of cooks, countless servants, and a small army of food tasters, because the possibility of being poisoned was never far from anyone's mind. You could say that dinner in the palace was equal parts feast and paranoia. Speaking of paranoia, let's talk about the ritual of food tasting. Every dish, every drink that went near the Khan's table had to be tested first. A dedicated team of tasters sampled each platter to prove it wasn't laced with something lethal. Which raises the awkward question: how many tasters didn't make it through their careers alive? The sources don't say, but one imagines the turnover rate was brisk. Even the vessels mattered. Kublai, for instance, had golden cups for his mare's milk, but they weren't just decorative. Gold was believed to reveal poison by reacting with it. If the milk bubbled or changed color, the unlucky taster was about to have a very bad evening. And then there were the seating arrangements. Eating near the Khan wasn't an honor so much as a carefully choreographed act of submission. You sat where you were told, you ate what you were given, and you didn't dare reach for the wrong piece of mutton. People were executed for less. Imagine trying to enjoy dinner while also calculating the exact amount of chewing noise that wouldn't offend a man who conquered Persia before lunch. Despite this terrifying atmosphere, the Mongols also had their softer, almost comical culinary quirks. One favorite dish was described by Persian chroniclers as grilled lamb with onions. But the onions had to be peeled and chopped by slaves, who then fanned the meat while it roasted on skewers. If a single piece came out underdone, it was considered an insult. There's no record of how often the cooks survived. And then there was the odd fondness for dairy. The Mongols consumed butter, yogurt, curds, and cheeses in quantities that could frighten modern cardiologists. One description says that during summer, the palace stores were filled with white food, which meant dairy in all its forms. It was seen as cooling, pure, and worthy of the ruling elite. Meanwhile, anyone visiting from the Middle East or Europe usually spent the first week with stomach cramps. Cultural exchange has always had its digestive price. But here's where it gets more interesting. The way the Khan ate wasn't just about his personal appetite, it was a signal of empire. To sit down at the Khan's feast was to be reminded of his wealth, his reach, his sheer ability to consume the world. Ambassadors from Venice or Persia would find themselves staring at dishes that had traveled hundreds of miles to land on the table. Fresh fruit from southern China, spices from India, sugar from Central Asia. It wasn't just dinner. It was a map of conquest in edible form. And yet, for all the grandeur, some habits stayed stubbornly nomadic. Kublai, despite his massive Chinese palace, still preferred to eat inside a yurt. He had silk tents built inside the palace courtyards so he could dine properly, surrounded by the smell of felt, horse tack, and wood smoke. It was a strange blend of rustic and imperial, like eating caviar while sitting on a camping stool. Now, you might think that with such massive banquets, the Khans would all end up overweight and sluggish. And you'd be right. Several later Mongol rulers developed impressive waistlines. Chroniclers politely described them as prosperous or magnificent in girth. The unspoken reality was that they were living examples of what happens when you replace riding 10 hours a day with sitting in a palace drinking fermented milk like it's water. Kublai himself was famously corpulent. One envoy described him as a mountain of a man, which was not meant as a compliment. He had trouble walking unassisted and relied on attendants to lift him into the saddle. But still, his banquets continued, each meal a reminder that power doesn't slim the waistline. Of course, not everything about feeding the Khan was indulgent. There were rules, deeply superstitious ones. Food had to be handled in certain ways. Knives were never pointed toward the Khan's bowl. Bones had to be placed in designated containers, not tossed aside. Even spilling a drink near the Khan was seen as a dangerous omen. To work in his kitchens was to live in constant fear that butter might fall at the wrong angle. And yet, for all this tension, one can almost picture the scene: the soft light of lamps glowing on golden cups, the sound of horsemen outside guarding the palace, the aroma of boiled meat filling the air. Courtiers whispering carefully, servants hurrying silently, and at the center, the great Khan, calmly tearing into a leg of lamb as if the fate of empires rested in the grease on his fingers. And perhaps it did. Because here's the quiet truth: empires are fueled by logistics, and logistics often boil down to dinner. The Mongol armies marched on mutton and mare's milk, preserved in little leather bags that dangled from saddles. They conquered on diets of dried meat and curd. The Khan's table, then, was a grand extension of this, proof that what kept the warriors alive could also dazzle foreign dignitaries. It's strangely poetic. Behind all the fear, the executions, and the lavish spreads, the Mongol feast was really a reflection of survival food, dressed up with gold and ceremony. And that makes feeding the great Khan not just an act of service, but a performance of empire. So tonight, as you let your eyes grow heavy, imagine the distant sounds of horse hooves outside a yurt. Picture a golden cup filled with sour, fizzy milk. And picture the ruler of half the known world, hunched comfortably over a steaming bowl of mutton, ruling with one hand while picking lamb shanks clean with the other. Because sometimes, history really is just dinner. The life of Hurrem Sultan, circa 1502 to 1558. Hey again. Let's drift now from the wind-blown steppes of the Mongols into the perfumed, candlelit corridors of the Ottoman court. It's the early 16th century. A place where power was measured not just in soldiers or cannons, but in who managed to get the Sultan's attention after dinner. And in that delicate, dangerous game, one woman stood out more than anyone else. Her name, at least the one history remembers, was Hurrem Sultan. She lived from around 1502 to 1558, and her life remains one of the great improbable success stories of royal courts. The story of a slave who became the legal wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and in the process, changed Ottoman politics forever. So, if you're settled in, let's wander into the Topkapi Palace, where the walls had ears, the cushions were embroidered, and nothing was ever as relaxed as it seemed. Hurrem was not born into luxury. Most sources suggest she was born somewhere in Ruthenia, which today roughly maps onto western Ukraine. Her birth name may have been Roxolana, meaning the girl from Ruthenia, though the Ottomans never called her that. She was likely captured during one of the endless border raids, sold into slavery, and eventually delivered into the Ottoman imperial harem. Now, the imperial harem was not the fantasy of silken pillows and languid lounging you sometimes see in old paintings. It was more like a training academy for potential consorts. Girls were taught manners, music, languages, embroidery, and, most importantly, how to navigate a palace where one wrong move could send you from favorite companion to forgotten servant. It was less spa retreat, more political boot camp. Into this world, the young woman who became Hurrem arrived. She was not especially beautiful, at least according to the rather blunt observations of some ambassadors. One Venetian described her as not the most handsome of women, which is polite Renaissance diplomat speak for looked fine from a distance. But she had something rarer than conventional beauty, charisma. She laughed often, she charmed easily, and she had the unnerving ability to make people feel as though they were the most important person in the room. That, combined with cleverness and ambition, was her true weapon. Enter Sultan Suleiman, also known as the Magnificent, or, in less flattering domestic circles, the Lawgiver, because nothing kills the mood like a man obsessed with legislation. He inherited the throne in 1520, young, handsome, and convinced that destiny had marked him for greatness. And like many sultans, he had access to an entire palace wing filled with women carefully prepared to please him. But somehow, out of all of them, it was Hurrem who caught his eye. Or perhaps she caught his ear. Reports suggest she laughed at his jokes. Which, considering most monarchs weren't exactly known for their sense of humor, might have been revolutionary. Imagine the boldness of laughing at a man who commanded the world's largest army. Yet, she did, and Suleiman kept coming back for more. Before long, she became his favorite consort. Then his most trusted confidant. And eventually, against every precedent, his wife. That last part is crucial, because Ottoman sultans did not marry their concubines. They might father children with them, they might elevate them to favored status, but marriage? That was a line rarely crossed. Suleiman, of course, decided to step across it. Because why not complicate your empire by giving your court factions one more reason to glare at each other during dinner? Hurrem bore Suleiman several children, and this alone made her position precarious. The Ottoman succession system was famously brutal. Multiple sons by multiple mothers usually led to murderous rivalries. The tradition was that once a sultan died, the surviving sons fought it out until one emerged victorious, and then promptly executed his brothers to avoid awkward family reunions. It was not, shall we say, the healthiest environment in which to raise children. And yet, Hurrem navigated it with ruthless skill. She supported her own sons, undermined rivals, and, most famously, clashed with another powerful woman, Mahidevran Sultan, Suleiman's earlier favorite. The two women despised each other, and their rivalry sometimes spilled into physical altercations. At one point, Mahidevran reportedly struck Hurrem during a fight. You might think that would end badly for the newcomer, but in a rare case of palace politics working in her favor, it only deepened Suleiman's attachment to her. He sided with Hurrem. Mahidevran was gradually pushed aside, and Hurrem's influence solidified. What makes Hurrem fascinating is not just that she survived, but that she thrived. She transformed her role from favored concubine into something closer to a queen. She commissioned mosques, schools, and charitable foundations. She corresponded with foreign rulers, including the King of Poland, signing letters as if she were a monarch in her own right. Ambassadors soon realized that currying favor with Hurrem was as important as currying favor with Suleiman. She was, in every practical sense, part of the government. Of course, all this came with the usual swirl of accusations. Contemporary chroniclers, mostly men who disliked powerful women, accused her of witchcraft, manipulation, and general moral corruption. Venetian envoys in particular painted her as a schemer who bewitched Suleiman and made him abandon centuries of tradition. Which, to be fair, she kind of did. But it's also possible that these envoys were just struggling to explain how a sultan could genuinely be in love with his wife. That concept baffled many observers at the time. One of the darker chapters of Hurrem's influence was the fate of Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son by Mahidevran. Mustafa was popular, charismatic, and seen by many as the natural heir, which, unfortunately, made him an obstacle to Hurrem's own sons. Over time, whispers of conspiracy reached Suleiman's ears, rumors that Mustafa was plotting to overthrow him. Whether those rumors were true or skillfully planted, we'll never know. But in 1553, Suleiman had Mustafa strangled during a military campaign. This act shocked the empire. Soldiers wept, courtiers despaired, and Suleiman's reputation darkened. And though Hurrem was never openly blamed, suspicion lingered that she had nudged events toward this outcome. It's a chilling reminder that in courts where succession meant survival, family life was less bedtime story, more blood-soaked chess match. Yet, Hurrem was not simply a manipulator behind the scenes. She and Suleiman appear to have shared a genuine partnership. Surviving letters between them reveal affection, tenderness, and even mild domestic banter. She referred to him as my sultan and my joy, while he called her my beloved and my confidant. It's startlingly humanizing. Beneath the towering turbans and imperial titles, they were a couple who wrote to each other like lovesick teenagers, albeit ones who ruled an empire. As for Hurrem's final years, they were marked by illness but also by enduring influence. She died in 1558, several years before Suleiman. He was deeply affected, commissioning a grand mausoleum for her near his own in Istanbul. Today, you can still visit her tomb at the Suleimani Mosque complex, a quiet, domed chamber filled with delicate tiles and calligraphy. It's oddly peaceful, considering the turbulence of her life. And with her death, the palace didn't exactly grow calmer. Her sons continued to feud, rivals schemed, and the harem remained its usual cauldron of whispers. But Hurrem had already altered the landscape. She had proven that a woman of foreign birth, enslaved as a girl, could rise to become not just the Sultan's wife, but his political partner. The age of powerful Ottoman queens, sometimes called the Sultanate of Women, had begun. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the quiet courtyards of Topkapi at night. Lanterns flickering, the Bosphorus just beyond the palace walls. Somewhere inside, Hurrem walks past the tiled halls, her laughter echoing, a sound that once bent the empire itself toward her. A reminder that sometimes, history's greatest power moves are made not with armies, but with charm, wit, and the ability to outlast every rival at court. Because in the end, Hurrem Sultan's story is not just one of survival, it's one of audacious, improbable triumph. Music in ancient Greece. Hey everyone! Let's drift now to a place far from Ottoman palaces and Mongol yurts. A place of olive groves, sea breezes, and marble temples that somehow always seem to be described as gleaming, though I suspect they were mostly dusty. Tonight, we're wandering into ancient Greece, where music was not just background noise, but a pillar of education, religion, and even medicine. It's easy to forget that when the Greeks weren't inventing democracy, or arguing about the shape of the cosmos, they were also plucking away on stringed instruments. And unlike us, they didn't treat music as optional entertainment. To them, it was part of the soul. Which, given how much they also enjoyed wine, says a lot about the Greek idea of soulfulness. Let's start with the basics, the lyre. If you've ever seen a vase painting of some toga-clad youth looking suspiciously smug while holding a U-shaped instrument, that's the lyre. It had a tortoise shell as a sound box, because of course it did, and strings made of animal gut. Which means that when you listen to a lyre concert in Athens, you were hearing the gentle vibrations of repurposed livestock. Charming, really. The lyre wasn't just for fun. It was considered essential for education. Aristocratic boys were expected to learn how to play it, much as children today are tortured with the recorder. A proper citizen wasn't fully trained unless he could accompany a poem with a tune. The idea was that music disciplined the mind, soothed the spirit, and made you less likely to run headfirst into foolishness. Though, judging from the endless wars between Greek city-states, this theory had its limits. Then there was the aulos. If the lyre was gentle and dignified, the aulos was its louder, brasher cousin. It was basically a double pipe reed instrument, producing a sharp, penetrating sound somewhere between two oboes and a goose having a tantrum. This was the instrument associated with Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstatic frenzy. Which makes sense, nothing says festival like a piercing wall of sound while everyone is drinking themselves into philosophical insights. The aulos was controversial. Plato, in particular, was not a fan. He thought it stirred up too much emotion and distracted the soul from higher contemplation. One imagines him muttering into his beard while some enthusiastic young man blasted away on twin reeds nearby. But for ordinary people, the aulos was irresistible. It accompanied dances, feasts, and, somewhat unfortunately, battlefield marches. Soldiers going into combat were often egged on by the aulos, which must have been both inspiring and mildly irritating. Music wasn't just performance, it was also theory, and the Greeks, being Greeks, had endless debates about it. They believed music shaped character, what they called ethos. Certain musical modes, what we might think of as scales, were thought to instill particular qualities. The Dorian mode supposedly encouraged courage and steadiness. The Phrygian mode stirred up excitement and passion. And the Lydian mode was, apparently, rather soft and decadent. Parents worried that too much Lydian would make their sons grow up lazy. So yes, the ancient equivalent of turn off that music, it'll rot your brain was already in full swing by 400 BCE. Pythagoras, yes, the triangle guy, was also deeply interested in music. He noticed that plucking a string of a certain length produced a pitch, and that having the string made the pitch jump an octave. From this he concluded that the universe itself was structured by harmony. He called it the music of the spheres, an idea that the stars and planets moved in cosmic ratios, humming away inaudibly in perfect celestial order. It's a lovely thought, though if you've ever tuned an instrument, you know the universe probably has more flat notes than you'd like to admit. Music saturated religious life too. Festivals to Apollo, the god of music and the lyre, were filled with hymn competitions. Imagine priests not only chanting but entering song contests, with Apollo presumably judging silently from Olympus. Orpheus, the mythical musician, was said to have charmed animals, rivers, even the stones themselves with his lyre. Which is another way of saying the Greeks really believed music had supernatural power. In rituals, music was not an accessory. It was the method of contact. Chants, accompanied by lyres or pipes, were believed to soothe the gods, guide sacrifices, and align human communities with divine will. Without music, a ceremony was basically incomplete, like trying to hold a wedding with no rings, or worse, no cake. Let's not forget theater. Greek tragedy and comedy, those grand inventions of Athens, were inseparable from music. The chorus didn't just shout lines, they sang them, often with instrumental backing. That means your favorite Sophocles drama was originally closer to a musical than to the solemn readings we imagine today. Try picturing Oedipus Rex performed with catchy tunes in the background. It's less intimidating, but possibly more enjoyable. And of course, there were contests. The Greeks loved competitions in everything, including music. At festivals like the Panathenea, musicians competed for prizes, sometimes golden crowns, sometimes jars of olive oil, which sounds less glamorous but was actually valuable. Winning such contests brought fame, patronage, and, inevitably, the envy of rivals. Ancient critics complained about musicians showing off too much with elaborate runs and flourishes. In other words, the age-old battle between traditionalists and flashy virtuosos was alive and well even in 500 BCE. Now, here's a gentler detail: the Greeks used music for healing. They genuinely believed certain tunes could calm the mind and restore balance in the body. Doctors recommended music therapy for disorders of the spirit, which makes them sound oddly modern. A famous story tells of a man overcome with drunken rage, calmed instantly when a musician played a sober Dorian melody. It's a charming anecdote, though I suspect the hangover did most of the real work. We also have glimpses of how music sounded, thanks to surviving fragments of notation. Greek musical notation was written with special symbols above the text of songs. A few pieces have been reconstructed, like the Psycholos epitaph, carved on a tombstone in the 1st century CE. The words are tender. As long as you live, shine. Don't grieve too much. Life is short. Time demands its due. Set to music, it's hauntingly simple, almost lullaby-like. Imagine those notes floating across a symposium 2,000 years ago, soft plucking of a lyre, voices rising gently, reminding everyone that even the greatest philosophers are not exempt from mortality. Daily life, too, had its soundtrack. Farmers sang work songs. Sailors chanted rhythms to keep the oars moving in unison. Children learned little rhymes. And in the symposium, the Greek equivalent of a tipsy evening with friends, music was always present. Guests reclined on couches, drank wine, and took turns singing. Some plucked the lyre themselves, while others hired professionals to do the heavy lifting. It wasn't karaoke night exactly, but it had the same blend of pride, awkwardness, and tipsy enthusiasm. Women's roles in music were complicated. Respectable wives weren't usually performers, but professional women musicians, often courtesans, played at banquets. They wielded the aulos, danced, and provided entertainment that was both musical and, let's say, socially flexible. This blurred line between art and intimacy gave music a somewhat scandalous edge, especially in the eyes of moralizing philosophers. Over time, as Greece fell under Roman rule, their musical traditions mingled with Roman tastes. The grand theorizing about modes continued, but the actual soundscape shifted toward louder, more theatrical performances. Yet the Greek legacy lingered. The medieval and Renaissance obsession with harmony, proportion, and the moral effect of music all traced back to those philosophical debates in Athens, when Plato tried in vain to outlaw the aulos. So, as your eyes grow heavy, imagine the glow of a torch in a marble courtyard. A youth plucks softly on a lyre, the strings warm in the night air. Nearby, someone lifts an aulos, the twin pipes keening across the dark. Around them, friends recline with cups of wine, half asleep already, murmuring about courage, passion, and the curious fact that music, somehow, makes all of it feel a little more bearable. Because in the end, for the Greeks, music wasn't just entertainment. It was education, therapy, prayer, and philosophy, all strung together by gut strings stretched across a tortoise shell. And really, that's a kind of harmony worth remembering. The life of Joan of Arc, circa 1412 to 1431. Hey everyone! Let's drift tonight into late medieval France. A land of muddy fields, endless wars, and monarchs who seemed allergic to making good decisions. And somewhere in all that chaos, a young peasant girl, barely a teenager, decided she'd had enough of waiting for adults to sort things out. Her name was Joan of Arc, though in French she was Jeanne la Pucelle, Joan the Maid. Now, Joan's story is usually told in tones of thunder and lightning, visions, battles, fiery martyrdom. But tonight, we'll take it slowly. No clashing swords. No dramatic soundtracks. Just the steady footsteps of a stubborn young woman who managed to wedge herself into the history books by being more persistent than entire councils of men in armor. So, if you're comfortable, let's wander into her world. Joan was born around 1412, in a little village called Domremy, on the borderlands of France and the Holy Roman Empire. The 100 Years' War was still grinding on, a war that had already lasted longer than most people's lifespans. France was fractured. The English held large parts of the north. The French king, Charles VI, had gone mad. His son, the Dauphin Charles, lived in a constant state of defeatism, clinging to scraps of territory along the Loire River. Into this gloomy picture, Joan arrived. She was not noble, not educated, not even particularly wealthy. Her father was a farmer. She grew up tending sheep, learning prayers, and doing the usual village chores, fetching water, grinding grain, and probably complaining about it like every teenager since time began. There was nothing in her background that suggested she would one day command armies. But history loves the improbable. When Joan was around 13, she began to experience what she called voices. These weren't whispers in the dark so much as visions of saints, Michael the Archangel, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. According to her later testimony, they told her that she had been chosen for a divine mission, to drive the English out of France and to help the Dauphin claim his rightful crown. Now, to most people, this would sound like the kind of adolescent overconfidence that should be gently redirected towards safer hobbies, like embroidery. But Joan was convinced. And unlike most visionaries, she actually did something about it. She first approached local officials, insisting that she needed to be taken to the Dauphin. Unsurprisingly, they laughed. But she persisted. She gained a small group of supporters who, whether from faith or curiosity, decided to help her. Eventually, in 1429, at the age of 17, she managed to secure an audience with Charles, the Dauphin. Here's where the story gets more interesting. Charles, cautious and skeptical, decided to test her. He disguised himself among his courtiers, letting another man sit on the throne. When Joan entered, she walked straight past the impostor and bowed to Charles himself. It's the kind of scene that sounds theatrical, but according to multiple accounts, it really happened. Whatever the trick or divine intuition, Joan had passed the test. From that moment, Charles took her seriously. Which is saying something, since he hadn't taken much of anything seriously for years. Joan's next step was bolder still. She insisted on being given armor, a banner, and command alongside French generals. Imagine the absurdity, a teenage girl, with no military training, walking into a war council full of seasoned men and saying, "Yes, I'll be leading the charge, thank you." And somehow, they agreed. Perhaps because they had nothing to lose. The French war effort was already a disaster. And if nothing else, Joan's presence injected a kind of strange, desperate hope. She was given white armor, a horse, and a banner embroidered with holy figures. And with this unlikely ensemble, she rode to Orleans, a city under siege by the English. Now, don't picture her as swinging a sword and cutting down foes like a Hollywood hero. That's not really what happened. Joan's role was more symbolic and motivational. She rode at the front, banner in hand, calling soldiers to follow. She prayed, encouraged, and shamed hesitant commanders into action. Against all odds, her presence worked. The French, inspired or embarrassed, surged forward. In a matter of days, they lifted the siege of Orleans. For a kingdom long accustomed to defeat, this was electrifying. A peasant girl had achieved what generals could not. News spread quickly. Joan became a sensation, hailed as a messenger of God. Soldiers began to believe that with her, victory was inevitable. And in medieval warfare, belief often mattered more than numbers. After Orleans, Joan pushed for the Dauphin to be crowned king. This required a journey to Reims, deep in enemy territory. Somehow, she persuaded Charles and his hesitant advisors to take the risk. And, astonishingly, they succeeded. In July 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France, with Joan standing proudly at his side. She had fulfilled one of her visions. But of course, reality has a way of ruining triumphs. After the coronation, Joan's influence began to wane. Charles, now comfortably crowned, reverted to his usual indecision. Joan wanted to keep pressing the English, to drive them out entirely. The king preferred treaties, negotiations, and long pauses. The spark that had carried France to sudden victories began to flicker. Joan herself was eventually captured in 1430, near Compiègne. She had been leading a small force, but her luck ran out. The Burgundians, French allies of the English, took her prisoner and sold her to the English. And here begins the most infamous chapter of her life, her trial. The English were determined to discredit her. They couldn't allow their soldiers to believe they'd been defeated by a girl with divine backing. So they charged her with heresy, witchcraft, and, rather laughably, cross-dressing. This last accusation came from the fact that Joan often wore men's armor and clothing, which, to be fair, was much more practical when riding into battle. The trial was long, hostile, and stacked against her. Learned theologians grilled her with trick questions, hoping to catch her in contradiction. Yet, by all accounts, Joan held her ground. She answered calmly, cleverly, and often with more wit than her interrogators. At one point, when asked whether she was in God's grace, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there." It was the kind of answer that both sidestepped and outshone the question. Still, no amount of cleverness could change the outcome. The verdict was foregone. In 1431, at the age of 19, Joan was condemned to death. She was burned at the stake in Rouen, before a crowd of thousands. It was a grim end, though not unusual for the 15th century, which treated public executions as a sort of morbid community event. And yet, even her death didn't silence her. 25 years later, the church retried her case, posthumously, of course, which wasn't much consolation for Joan, and declared her innocent. Centuries later, in 1920, she was canonized as a saint. Today, she's one of France's national heroes, her statues scattered across towns and cathedrals. But here's the thing to notice, in our drowsy reflection. Joan wasn't remarkable for military genius, or even for strategy. What set her apart was conviction. She believed with a stubborn intensity, and that belief proved contagious. She embarrassed men into bravery, shamed kings into action, and turned despair into momentum. For a while, that was enough to change the course of a kingdom. So, as you drift off, picture a muddy French camp at dawn. Soldiers weary, discouraged, half-hearted. And then, a young woman in white armor rides past, banner fluttering. She doesn't shout, she doesn't boast, she simply believes. And for a moment, that belief becomes theirs too. Because sometimes, history isn't about the strongest sword or the cleverest plan. Sometimes, it's just about the stubborn certainty of one unlikely voice. Joan of Arc, the trial and the echo. Hey everyone. Let's stay with Joan tonight a little longer. We already wandered through her beginnings in Domremy, her visions, and her improbable rise beside the Dauphin. But as always with royals, clergy, and power in general, the story doesn't end with victory. It drifts on into paperwork, paranoia, and committees of men in robes trying to feel important. In other words, her trial. So, let's step quietly into the city of Rouen in 1431. At this time, Rouen was under English occupation. The English were not exactly enjoying their stay in France. They were bogged down, resented, and facing constant skirmishes. And then there was Joan. To English soldiers, she was both terrifying and humiliating. Terrifying because she seemed unstoppable, humiliating because they'd had to explain to their commanders that they'd been defeated by a girl with a flag. You can imagine the morale reports. So once they had Joan in custody, they wanted to make sure no one would ever see her as a holy figure again. The goal was simple: discredit her, strip her of her divine aura, and, if possible, make her look like a dangerous fraud. Now, medieval trials were rarely about truth-seeking. They were theater. A long ritual designed to confirm whatever outcome the authorities already wanted. In Joan's case, the English paid for the show, but they let the church handle the script. They thought it would look more respectable that way, less political revenge, more righteous judgment. So, the trial opened in February 1431. The panel consisted of theologians, bishops, and clerks, most of them loyal to the English, or at least loyal to their own careers. Presiding over it all was Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais. Cauchon is remembered, rather unflatteringly, as the man who steered the proceedings. He was intelligent, ambitious, and determined to please his English patrons. Which means he had exactly the qualities one does not want in a fair judge. The charges against Joan were many and varied, but they kept circling around a few themes. First, her visions. The court demanded to know whether her voices came from God, or, as they heavily suggested, from the devil. After all, a simple peasant girl couldn't possibly receive divine messages without clerical permission. Second, her clothing. Yes, one of the main charges was her insistence on wearing men's clothes and armor. Medieval society was deeply invested in the idea that people must dress according to their gender. A woman in armor was practically an act of cosmic rebellion. Never mind that trousers were simply more practical for riding into battle and not falling off your horse. Third, her obedience. Or lack of it. She had ignored church authorities, gone her own way, and claimed direct instructions from God. That was unsettling. Not least because if God was bypassing the clergy, then what exactly was the clergy for? The questioning was long and exhausting. Day after day, the judges hammered her with queries, often designed as traps. For instance, when they asked, "Do you know if you are in God's grace?" they were setting up a neat dilemma. If she said yes, it would sound like arrogance. If she said no, she'd admit guilt. Her answer, as we mentioned earlier, was a small masterpiece. If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there. In one sentence, she sidestepped the trap and left her judges looking like fools. Moments like that kept slipping through, this uneducated farm girl standing toe-to-toe with trained theologians, and somehow coming out with more clarity. It didn't save her, of course. But it made her memorable. The trial dragged on into the spring. Observers noted that Joan stayed remarkably calm. She was often firm, sometimes even sardonic. When pressed about St. Michael's appearance, she was asked whether he had wings, hair, and a body. She replied, "Do you think God has nothing better to do than make him a wig?" Which, frankly, is the kind of response we all wish we could summon in exams. Still, we'd only carried her so far. By May, the judges reached their conclusion, guilty of heresy. Now, technically, she was given a chance to save herself. The court offered her a deal: if she recanted, confessed her errors, and stopped wearing men's clothes, she would be spared execution. Under pressure, and perhaps in fear, Joan signed a short abjuration. She admitted her visions might have been false and agreed to change her dress. For a moment, it looked like she might escape the fire. Instead, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. But here's the catch. A few days later, guards reported that Joan had resumed wearing men's clothing. Accounts differ on why. Some say her dress had been taken away, leaving her no choice. Others suggest she simply chose to return to her practical attire. Either way, this was enough for the judges to declare her a relapsed heretic. And in medieval canon law, relapse meant there was no second chance. The outcome was sealed. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led into the marketplace of Rouen. A crowd had gathered, as they always did for executions. Public burnings were grim, but also communal. People watched with a mix of fascination and dread, telling themselves that the fire was cleansing the world of evil. Joan, still only 19, was tied to a tall wooden stake. She asked for a cross, and someone handed her a rough wooden one. A sympathetic English soldier also fashioned a small cross from wood and gave it to her. She held it tightly as the flames rose. Witnesses reported that she called on Jesus until the end. The executioners burned her body twice over, to prevent relics from being collected. They threw her ashes into the Seine. Which, of course, only deepened her legend. Nothing fuels sainthood quite like a public attempt to erase it. And yet, as we let this scene settle in the quiet of our minds, notice how anticlimactic it was for her enemies. The English hoped her death would destroy her influence. Instead, it did the opposite. Word of her composure, her courage, and her refusal to break spread quickly. In France, she became a martyr. For Charles VII, she became a convenient symbol, though he, cautious as ever, didn't exactly rush to rescue her in the first place. Decades later, in 1456, a retrial was held at the request of Joan's family. This time, the outcome was quite different. The court, now working under French rather than English influence, declared her innocent and condemned the earlier trial as corrupt. Centuries after that, in 1920, the Catholic Church officially canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc. From condemned heretic to saint, that's quite a turnaround. Though, as usual, it took the Church several hundred years to make up its mind. So, what lingers for us in this quiet retelling? Maybe it's the irony of it all. Joan never asked for power. She didn't try to start a dynasty, didn't amass wealth, didn't even survive long enough to build a household. She simply believed stubbornly, relentlessly, in her mission. That was enough to terrify armies, confuse scholars, and unsettle kings. And in the end, she left behind something that outlasted her brief 19 years, a story. A story so compelling that not even the stake at Rouen could burn it away. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, picture not the fire but the river. The Seine, carrying ashes quietly downstream, while the city of Rouen fades into evening. The crowd disperses. The judges return to their papers. The soldiers mutter among themselves. And yet, across France, a tale is already forming that a girl from Domremy, with no armor but her certainty, had changed the fate of a kingdom. It's a gentle reminder, as history often is, that the quiet conviction of one person can ripple far beyond their years.